Hello! My first video on this channel attempted to answer the question, how many countries are there in the world? I'll put a link to that up here and also down in the comments below. I concluded that there were 236 countries, of which I'd been to 113. Which got me thinking, out of the countries that I've been to, which ones am I most keen to return to, and which ones am I least keen to go and see again? And of the countries I haven't visited, which ones are going to be top of my list, and which ones are probably at the bottom. So that's 6 countries in 4 videos, so 24 in total. And I hope these help you make some informed decisions about where you may choose to go next. Today I'm going to talk about the countries that I've been to but I'm least keen to return to. If a tourist board from one of these 6 countries wants to try to change my mind, they're more than welcome. Couple on here controversial, certainly number 6, possibly also number 5. So stick around.
Hi, I'm Matt. Over the last 25 years, I've travelled a lot. I've lived in 5 countries on 4 continents. I've flown over 1.3 million miles. I've visited over 100 countries, every American state, but I'm nowhere near done. So hit subscribe to see where I go next and perhaps get some inspiration for your next trip.
Before we start, let me say that I've never actively disliked anywhere that I've been. Well, I disliked number 2 on this list quite a lot when I first got there, and I'll explain why when we get to it. These are countries that I've been to, I enjoyed. Simply, I've just enjoyed other countries more. So number 1 on this list is Kuwait. I went to Kuwait for 3 days in February 2006. Kuwait had been a feature of the news throughout the 90s, and I'd also worked with somebody who'd been in Kuwait during the occupation and had had to stay in her apartment for months, never going above the level of the windows for fear of being spotted. It sounded like a fascinating place and I was pretty keen to see for myself. And I saw it. It was interesting enough. I went up to Kuwait Towers where there was a bit of an exhibition on the occupation. I saw a very interesting dhow harbour, but I don't remember much else. There wasn't a lot there for the tourist in 2006 and I'm not sure there's a lot more now. So that's number 1. Kuwait. Number 2 on my list is Venezuela. I went to Venezuela for 13 days in November 1995. Venezuela has been in the news quite regularly recently, and many of you will recognise the name Hugo Chavez. He was the populist socialist leader who either created a socialist paradise or ran the country into the ground, depending on your point of view. I'll reserve judgment. Chavez only came to power in 1999, which was 4 years after I visited. Although he attempted his first coup in 1992, 3 years before I got there. So the 90s were fairly tumultuous for the country, and I was there right in the middle of it. At the time, I was working for Intercontinental Hotels, and I needed to visit the property. The hotel was located up in the hills overlooking the main city of Caracas. I'd heard that the hotel was completely safe. Indeed, when the government sent out the tanks to break up demonstrations, the good and the great of Caracas would head up the hills to the hotel to ride out the unpleasantness. The words coup and tank aren't ones I aspire to use when it comes to travel anecdotes. There was no real internet that I could use to research the place back in those days, but as the company was happy to send me, I was happy to go. I arrived late at night, the last flight of the day if I remember correctly, and the hotel had promised to send a car to pick me up. But on my way down they decided that I wasn't coming, and so they cancelled the car. So as I wandered around a progressively darkening terminal trying to find my ride, none was there, so I ended up having to take a taxi. The one thing I had read about Caracas was to avoid the taxis. Caracas is 900 metres in the air and the airport is at sea level and the road between the two winds up through the hills. What I'd heard is that bandits would often drop concrete slabs from bridges on passing taxis to immobilise them and then rob the occupants. So it was with a degree of trepidation that I got in the cab and went up the hill. But I made it safely and the hotel was quite surprised to see me, but we checked in and everything was fine. But I have to say, in the 5 days I was in Caracas, I never left the hotel property. I was so spooked. Pretty cracking views of the city though. After Caracas, I flew to Ciudad Guiana to another intercontinental property on the banks of the Orinoco, and I also managed to squeeze in a side trip to the Angel Falls, which was spectacular. Venezuela was in a bit of a state back then, and I'm not sure it's much better now. So Venezuela is number 2 on my list for 2 reasons really. Firstly, I've seen most of the tourist highlights, although I'm told the Caribbean coast is pretty spectacular. And secondly, it's not a great idea to visit a country that is in the middle of an economic and humanitarian crisis. Uncontroversial so far, but wait for number 6. Leave me a comment if you think I'm being unfair or irrational, or if you agree. But for me, number 3 on the list is Russia. I first went to Russia in 1988 on a school trip with the infamous Russian tourist company Enquiries. We flew into Moscow, had a couple of days, took an overnight train to Leningrad, as St. Petersburg was called at the time, a couple of days there before flying home. Gorbachev was president, the words perestroika and glasnost were known, but it was still very, very Soviet, and it was a very, very interesting experience. I went back to St. Petersburg in August 2013 as an overnight stop on a Baltic cruise. It's a great city, full of art and history and culture, and I really enjoyed my time there. Do I want to go back? Not really. Russia has been a difficult place to love in recent years. Travel is about the people rather than the politicians that run a place, but when those politicians make the place so hard to love, you do tend to pay attention. As an example, getting a visa to Russia is a bit of a hassle. It's almost as if the politicians don't want you to visit. Travel to Russia has a few other challenges as well. English isn't widely spoken, and I certainly don't expect everyone around the world to speak my language, but it does present a challenge, particularly when the native script isn't English. Cyrillic isn't that difficult to pick up, and as long as you know your pectopaths from your BAPS, you'll be fine. But all of these things add together to make it the case that there are other countries that I think I'd prefer to go back to. Having been to Moscow and St. Petersburg, there's also not a lot else of Russian that I'm really keen to see. The next 3 biggest cities are Novosibirsk, Yekaterinburg and Nizhny Novgorod, none of which are exactly tourist meccas, and they're places you've probably only heard about from hosting games in the recent World Cup. I would like to go to Vladivostok one day, as it was always a mysterious place when I was growing up, Russian but further east than Manila or Seoul. So Russia is an interesting, historic country that doesn't seem to want visitors, so I'll take the hint and go somewhere else. So on to number 4. Slightly more controversial, but then again perhaps not. It's the Maldives. I went to the Maldives for 5 nights in 1998 after spending 10 days touring Sri Lanka. We stayed at a nice hotel, there was a nice beach, there was a nice pool, we went fishing. Do I want to go back? No. Don't get me wrong, I love a nice beach, I love a nice pool, and I love a nice hotel. But I also enjoy exploring a row of beach bars at sunset. I enjoy exploring the local town. I enjoy taking trips to nearby attractions, none of which is really possible when you go to the Maldives. When I was there, I do remember a sense of claustrophobia and also monotony from having to eat in the same place 3 times a day. In the centre of the island was staff accommodation with a clearing where in the afternoons they used to play football. I distinctly remember thinking that I would much rather go and play football with the staff than go and spend another couple of hours on the beach killing time before the next meal. It's expensive too. Oh, hello. If you were wondering, I didn't know what traditional Maldives music sounded like, so I use this instead. So if you really, really love the person you're going to go with, if you really, really love spending money, and if you really, really love checking into a posh resort and never leaving it until it's time to go home, then the Maldives is for you. It's just not for me. We're on to number 5, which might be a bit of a surprise. Costa Rica. I went to Costa Rica in 2010 as part of an excellent 3-week tour through Central America offered by Explore Worldwide Holidays. We started in Panama, went through Costa Rica, into Nicaragua, up into Honduras before ending in Guatemala. And I'd go back to any of those other countries before I go back to Costa Rica. There are many reasons to go to Costa Rica, so I understand why many do. It is by far the safest, the most developed country in the region, has the best tourist infrastructure, and has 1 million more visitors a year than any of its neighbours, many of those visitors coming from the United States. But compared to other countries, it's just a bit dull. It's famed for its biodiversity, and rightly so. It contains about 6% of all of the world's species, despite being only the size of West Virginia and 2/3 the size of Scotland. That's 500,000 species, or if you prefer, 500,000. That's got to be worth a visit, surely. It absolutely is, but 300,000 of those species are insects. And if that's your thing, knock yourself out. And if it is your thing, I've got a shed out back I could use your help with. Another 190,000 species are invertebrates of one form or another, and there are about 10,000 species of ferns and trees, so that biodiversity does thin down pretty quickly when you actually start to understand what it's made up of. There are lots of things to see, and we did certainly see a lot. We saw crocodiles, we saw snakes, we saw lots of birds, including the amazing quetzal, we saw a weird, huge raccoon thing, and of course, sloths. Sloths are amazing. They're cute, they're furry, they're very easy to find, and they can't really run away from you. The bottom line is that if you go to Costa Rica just because of the biodiversity, expecting it to look like the Serengeti or London Zoo, you might be a little disappointed. But it does have volcanoes, rainforests, cloud forests, friendly, welcoming people, a wonderful developed tourist infrastructure, and all joking aside, I would love to go back. But I think I'd rather go to Nicaragua, or Guatemala, or Honduras. Finally, it's controversial, it's unexpected, it's Italy. I first went to Italy, and specifically Rome, in 1999. I've since been to Sicily, I've been to Milan, I've been to Venice, and most recently Florence. And every time Italy has left me just a little bit flat. I've always found Italy to be jammed with tourists, expensive, a little bit chaotic, and everything aimed at the tourists is usually overpriced and of quite a poor quality. I've never found the tourist areas to be particularly friendly or welcoming. You get the sense that you're tolerated being there rather than being welcomed, which is probably true. I would make an exception with Venice. Wandering around an ancient city that is historic with amazing architecture, with no cars and no roads, is really an experience everyone should have. Look at the cruise timetables and try and pick a time when there are very few ships in, but go. So that's Italy. Sorry. Leave me a comment if you agree, or, as is more likely, disagree. Let me know the places that you're not so keen to go back to. Subscribe so that you'll be notified of other videos from me coming up. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you all next time.